All right, welcome back to the second episode of The Ripple Effect. I am your host, Henry Twagirayezu, and today we're going to be talking about the fall of the American Empire and exactly what's leading up to it or what's causing it. Before we get started, though, I have a few housekeeping asks or housekeeping tasks, whatever you want to call it. As you can see here, here's my Substack, my TikTok, and my X handles. This is where you can find anything relating to the ripple effect in terms of announcements, publications, posts, whatever you want to call it. This is the best way to stay up to date on the latest from the ripple effect. So please like, subscribe, and follow for more. All right, without further ado, let's talk about domestic policy first. So when it comes to domestic policy, there is a few reasons why we are seeing the very fast downturn to. All right, let's start with domestic policy. Domestic policy as it relates to the fall of the American Empire, to be specific. So there are a few reasons why the American Empire, as we see it today, is collapsing. And what I mean by collapsing, I mean obviously not able to sustain itself when it comes to emergency or disaster relief. We're looking at what is happening across the state, our president's response, across the nation, and our president's response to those natural disasters, and saying that it's ideal, for example, to turn that kind of responsibility to the state. The federal government has been able to do this, or in the past has been able to do this, but now suddenly, because of the contributing reasons that I'm about to get into, we're no longer able to deal with natural disasters in the way that we have in the past. And we're also not able to compete globally, let alone overtake China like our government seems to be very keen on doing. So let's begin with neoliberal economics, because I believe that this is the biggest source of trouble for the United States here at home. What I mean by neoliberal economics, and maybe if you watched the previous episode, you know that I use this term disparagingly. What I mean by neoliberal economics, I mean the type of economics or the economic thought that prioritizes shareholder returns over products that people are putting out, over the utility that human beings are getting out of these products, and so on and so on. The outsourcing of jobs in particular started around the late 70s, early 80s, when globalization was really taking a hold, and people thought that it was going to be, or at least the promise was that it was going to be beneficial, mutually beneficial for everybody who engages, whether it's the developed countries that are going to be benefiting in the form of cheaper labor, or developing nations that are going to be benefiting through investment in, factories that are going to be built up, that were supposedly going to be built up or that were actually, I don't want to take away from the contributions of neoliberal economics. It is true that we do have more factories and we do have more investment abroad, but the problem is the quality of this investment abroad. And then there's also the lack of antitrust enforcement. This is another thing that came out of the early 80s to late 80s, especially during the Reagan administration, when they sold the promise of deregulation as bringing in cheaper goods and being a benefit, an overall net positive for the consumer, when it was really all about, again, increasing shareholder returns by making sure that they can get away with anything, the type of things that we are now getting or feeling the repercussions of in the form of airplanes crashing, for example, or even DeepSeek, right? The way that it was able to perform so well and outperform OpenAI is because deregulation leads to less and less strong competition, which leads to weaker competition, which leads to weaker economic output as a result, or weaker products as a result. And then there's the biggest thing that I want to focus on for today, which is the tax breaks and subsidies for the rich. In the early 80s, the Reagan administration imposed the 1981 Recovery Tax Act, right, and the Tax Reform Act of 1986. What these acts did was cut public funding for incredibly important social programs, and cut public funding for things like schools, etc., and put more pockets in put more money in the pockets of rich people. And this type of trend continued into the early 2000s with the Bush tax cuts on capital gains and estate and income. And these Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 were then extended by Barack Obama. And then we finally had the 2017 tax cuts by Donald Trump, which today economic research says 86% of those benefits from those tax cuts went to corporations and individuals who made over 400K per year. So I hope that so far I'm painting a picture that shows the problem or kind of leads you to see where the problem could arise from doing things like this. If you cut taxes, and a lot of my friends and I were talking about this, finance guys and stuff like that, and they were talking about the possibility of, I think it was Donald Trump or somebody within the Republican Party who was floating the idea of abolishing income taxes. And although that sounds good on paper, and it sounds good, to the average person who's, to their mind, in their mind, they're going to be receiving, $2,000 more dollars or $3,000 more dollars, or however many, let's even say 20 or 10,000 more dollars. And that's going to benefit them for a short amount of time, obviously, until inflation corrects and takes that money back. But what's going to happen as a side effect, something that is much less talked about when selling this idea to the public, it's the fact that we're not going to get that tax revenue which we need in order to continue doing things like Social Security and paying for things like food stamps for people that need it, et cetera, et cetera. And we already have a massive deficit, which means that we are already in debt from not having collected taxes for the past 40, 50 years from the top whatever percent, especially the top 1%. So the idea that we're going to continue to slash taxes while running a deficit of 30-some trillion dollars is absolutely insane to me. It doesn't make any sense. But apart from that, we also have the second piece to the domestic policy that is clearly leading to the downfall of the American empire, and that is our obsession with optics and narratives. In America, we do not care about whether things actually work as promised. We only care about whether they look as if they work as promised. We don't care about getting to the root of an issue. We don't care about getting to the root of whatever sickness that our society is currently experiencing. Instead, we want to deal with the symptoms because it's cheaper to deal with the symptoms. It's easier to deal with the symptoms. And most people don't really care about the underlying causes anyways, the public, and this is failing on our part. I know it's taboo to ever place agency on the general public and the electorate itself, but the reason why this keeps happening is because we as an electorate, we simply don't care. We don't follow up. This is early, but we don't follow up with our politicians, with our representative, when we care about things, right, that affect us in our day-to-day lives. So as a result, this is what we get. So, and this is the video that I was actually going to play just now. It is Anna Kasparian from TYT, who I am not saying is a perfect commentator or the political analyst of, the decade or whatever, but I do think that she makes really good observations, frequently makes really good observations, and this is one of them. She talked about how the Democratic Party in particular, because they sold out to the establishment, to the deep state, as you call it, or as I would call it, they know that they cannot deliver on economic policy and on economic issues. So instead, they've decided to lean in and go heavily into social issues, which is why you heard things that didn't make any sense, like Latinx, when Latino people never used that term, when they started saying things like abolish cops or whatever, things that don't make any sense, that are rooted genuinely in true, valid social issues that should be solved, but that are so maximalist in a way that doesn't make any sense to the average person, and that clearly shows that this is a game to them. Because nobody who's serious is going to talk about abolishing the police. What are you talking about? This is a country of 327 million people. We need the police. So instead of actually dealing with the problems, with the material and significant problems that this country is facing, we focus on social issues and we use them as gimmicks in order to perpetuate economic inequality and pacify the concerns of the working class. This is facilitated by state-run propaganda that masks itself as news. When I say this, I mean CNN, I mean MSNBC, Fox News, the AP, I know, the Associated Press even, right? The Wall Street Journal definitely, the New York Times, all of these sources that are supposed to have an adversarial relationship with the government, but because, be it the government or the media, have all been corrupted by the influence of money, which I will also be getting into shortly. They are all working for the same guys, and the same guys is the deep state, which I previously alluded to, what some people call the deep state, what people call the oligarchs. But a long time ago, this might have been taboo to talk about. But because the shit's on fire for real, we have even the president who's sitting in the Oval Office, or the former president who was sitting in the Oval Office, giving his farewell address, talking about the problem with this country, which is that power lies in the hands of a very few group of people, these oligarchs, or the deep state, as I will be referring to. So with the help of state-sponsored censorship coming from those news or media outlets, and also, I want to be clear, it's not always clear why or who's influencing who, right? So sometimes you ask yourself, okay, is it the government that is forcing Twitter to ban an account because somebody somewhere out there posted an anti-Hillary Clinton meme or something during the 2015 elections? Is it the state that is forcing Zuckerberg to do this, or is it Zuckerberg who is volunteering to do this for the state in order to get benefits down the road later on? So what do I mean by this? Meta, for example, which acquired WhatsApp and acquired Instagram, has faced and could face in the future antitrust, if we bother to enforce antitrust regulation, could face some type of pushback from regulators regarding their acquisitions of smaller companies, because again, the antitrust laws as they exist right now, or as they're written right now, not enforced, but as they're written right now, if a company already exists and is already a giant within its sphere of whatever, within its sector, allowing it to grow and grow and grow under the law is a liability, because those corporations start to become so powerful that they can actually compete with the state when it comes to what kind of influence they can have over the citizens, right? So real life example of this is if Amazon employs 33% of the country, Amazon actually controls 33% of the country, because nobody has power over your life more than your employer. So because our previous governments, 100 years ago or whatever, came together and figured out that this was a problem and created these antitrust laws, a lot of companies that want to circumvent them will scratch the federal government's back in hopes of the federal government also scratching their back later on in the form of allowing their mergers and acquisitions to go through. And all of this is going to be, or it might sound like shocking news to some people, because we do have a well-oiled machine when it comes to propaganda, whether it is the social media apps that we have and the type of censorship campaigns that go on there. Now it's apparently hate speech to say Free Palestine on TikTok, even though that's a Chinese-controlled app or whatever. But whether it is the censorship that we see happening on social media apps, or the news that we see coming out of outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the way that they frame events dishonestly to herd people to a certain conclusion, this is what I mean by propaganda. We have a very strong propaganda machine in the United States, and the sad thing is that a lot of Americans think that it's other countries that are propagandized, when actually nobody's more propagandized than the American people. And then there's the issue of blatant corruption. And this one is the one that I'm always so surprised gets such little coverage, because in other countries, for example, in my country of origin, we talk about corruption all the time. Because if we see you doing something like that, if in Rwanda, if we see politicians being corrupt, taking money in a way that is sketchy, that is, that conflicts with the best interest of the public, I'm not saying that Rwanda is going to be 100% perfect in this regard, but this idea that the news outlets themselves are going to be running cover for a politician who is corrupt and trading stocks that he's also writing legislation on is bizarre. It doesn't go on, or at least I haven't seen it go on like this. But I digress. So getting into blatant corruption, right? I'd like to start with the Patriot Act. And this one doesn't seem like corruption on its face. It doesn't necessarily scream corruption. But the reason why I would call it corruption is because even though there's no money involved directly, it's still a violation of our constitutional rights as Americans in order to preserve power and therefore wealth for the deep state, which I previously talked about, and preserve wealth and power for the oligarchy that President Biden talked about in his farewell address. So because of that, I do see it's corruption. And then you see things like Jared NATO's relationship with Saudi Arabia, or Jared Kushner's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and things like the Hunter Biden relationship with Burisma and with Ukraine, and the type of corruption that goes on there. And if you're not familiar, Jared Kushner and Saudi Arabia corruption scandal, that was actually not a scandal because very few people have heard of it. It was this what looks like, allegedly, what looks like a pay-to-play scheme where the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund paid right as Trump was exiting his first administration, his first 4 years, paid $2 billion to Jared Kushner's private equity firm, and it's not very clear what these $2 billion investments from the Saudi government's sovereign wealth fund, so another country's money, right, popping into the son-in-law of the president's PE firm, right? And we don't know exactly what this was about, but we do know that when President Trump was in office during his first 4 years, that he had a very close relationship with the Saudis, right? And he let them get away with a lot. He let them get away with their blockade of Qatar. He let them get away with murdering and dismembering Jamal Khashoggi, who was a journalist that MBS had killed. And all of these things, right, are never talked about in the media outlets or rarely talked about in the media outlets that I mentioned. Why is that? Because of this corruption problem that I'm talking about. They're all working for the same people. Then there's Citizens United, right? The Citizens United decision, which I believe was 10 years ago, basically allowed, under the guise of free speech, for the government to for corporations to invest with no cap, with no limit, unlimited amounts of money in campaign to make campaign contributions with no limit. So basically buy elections, right? Because it's free speech and money is speech and corporations are people. Shit does not make any sense, right? But that particular decision, it is something that we should be spending significantly more time on. Our politicians, our journalists should be spending significantly more time on it, but nobody does because, again, everybody's working for the interests of a select few, and we know who they are. And APAC, right, benefits from this because, one, they're not registered as a foreign lobbying agency, whatever. They also get to make whatever types of contributions they would like, free nilly-nilly. And we, the American people who go out there and work and pay the taxes, again, because they're friends, the same group of people who are hijacking our government are also the same group of people, coincidentally, who are not paying their fair share of taxes. And these people, again, who are not contributing to taxes, are dictating where these taxes go by allowing themselves, like to politicians, to political campaigns, therefore controlling those political campaigns and whatever legislation that gets passed that affects you, me, the actual taxpayers, and anybody else that you care about, and them, right, benefits them because again they don't have to pay taxes, they don't have to register as foreign entities, they don't have to do anything. Here is Anna Kasparian explaining all of this for us. Let's go ahead and listen to what she has to say. This is where she starts to lose me. So I have a slightly different take to this. I do think that I don't think that the country's necessarily dripping with transphobes or whatever, but I do think that I think she is correct to point to the maximalism of the Democrats before Trump and during that in between period. The maximalism that they had towards like well, even in the in between, like I don't think Joe Biden was necessarily this like pro trans pro like he wasn't gung ho about it, but I do think that there was a certain period of time, especially I want to say between 2015 and 2020, people were very like weird, chronically online, like social justice warrior type shit that people are now just now starting to kind of like give backlash, right? Or whatever the correct way of framing it is. Now we're just now experiencing the backlash for having existed like that as a society for so long. The more you do something, it's kind of like one of those like ball things that like you know what I'm saying, and then pendulum swings, something like that. So basically, that's what's happening right now. We went too far to the left when it came to social issues, again, because we wanted to avoid going to the left when it came to economic issues. And now, the select few people who, like Anna said, are not necessarily, they're not a huge percentage of the population, but because they are getting to something that a huge portion of the population is feeling, they take an inch, right? You give them an inch and they take a mile, right? So it's like the inch that we gave them was, hey, we can turn down on this whole, you know, abolition of cops, and like we can turn down the whole rhetoric of, you know, the especially like when the Ibram X Kendis started coming out and they said everybody's inherently racist, no person, like stuff like that, right? That's the inch that we gave them. But then they started to paint with them being the Republicans started to paint with a broad brush, just saying, "Oh, DEI is bad in general. The diversity in general is bad," and it's too much. But I don't think that Anna's analysis that the problem is with the Democratic Party exclusively when it comes to the anti-trans sentiment that we're seeing today is 100% accurate. And then we'll move on to foreign policy, right? So, foreign policy, this is where things start to get really complicated, and I don't want to go off on tangents. I'll try my best not to. But we start with the unipolar world, and this is going to be the thing that Putin talks about in this video. Oh, spoiler alert! This video is not going to be another one from Anna Kasparian. It's going to be from Putin. He gave this speech in 2007, so almost 20 years ago. And by the way, when he gave this speech in 2007, this wasn't his first time giving the speech. This was his third, fourth, fifth time saying the same thing, but in a different font. And what he said, well, I'll play a portion of it shortly, but what he said was that the United States is a bully, right? The United States has created this unipolarity, and by unipolarity, that means that basically only one country gets to dictate what goes on, one country gets to dictate how the rest of the world functions. And he's basically, right, he said this in Munich. I think this was before the UN. And he makes this speech, he gives this speech in front of the Western countries, in front of all of the other global southern countries that are also watching who have been victimized by exactly what he's talking about. And what he says is that the world cannot exist in peace or in harmony if only one country is dictating what goes on, if only one country is dictating to the rest how they should behave, what society should deem acceptable or unacceptable. And he says that this is going to be a recipe for disaster. And I would say, 20 years later, that he seems to have been vindicated. One of the ways that the U.S. bullies other countries is by weaponizing the dollar. What I mean by weaponizing the dollar is that under our current system of doing things, when countries want to trade and settle trade imbalances between themselves, they have to do it through the dollar. They have to do it through the dollar, and when they hold reserves, they also have to hold dollars. And if you say, oh, well, why do they have to? So it's complicated, but one, they don't necessarily have to, but it's implied. And by implied, like, you will either get invaded, sanctioned to hell, or assassinated if you choose otherwise. But then there is the constantly, apart from the weaponization of the dollar, there's the constant weaponization of defense or we constantly, as the United States, we constantly put ourselves in a position where we make it seem as if we're just either observing and having to jump in because we have to, again, being the world's police. Not the world's police, we are like the world's mafia. That's more accurate. That we are just bystanders watching, and then or good actors that just jump in if one country's bullying the other. And that's what really happened when we went to Ukraine. Big bad Russia was bullying Ukraine. We had to step in to help them. But apart from all of that, right, I guess leaning a little bit further into all of that, I can give you multiple examples of the United States doing exactly this. One is the Truman Doctrine, right, which was the containment strategy of the Cold War, where we thought that we were going to stop communism, right, because we were afraid of big bad communists. And what we did was attack any country that had any type of leaning towards communism or had any type of relationship that we didn't like with the Soviet Union. And we also dishonestly found pretext to go kill anybody who wanted to have a relationship with the Russians or sought independence, whatever. One of the best examples of this is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the United States faked a naval attack in order to create pretext to attack and destroy Vietnam. To this day, I have a Vietnamese friend who recently went back to visit and was telling me that to this day, Vietnam is still reeling from acts and from the horrible things that the United States did to them decades and decades ago. So this is the price, right, of American bullying. This is the price of unipolarity. The United States can go and bomb Vietnam, secretly bomb Laos and Cambodia and all of these other countries using the pretext of big bad communism, or go and bomb Iraq, Afghanistan, destroy Libya, help the Saudis destroy Yemen under the guise of stopping terror, or fund what the Israelis are doing in Gaza under the guise of stopping terror. In this constant bullying, again, whether it's abroad, and we see the protests that are happening in Japan, in Russia, in Mexico, in Venezuela against the American empire's actions in the Middle East, or at home, where I personally attended a protest that had 300,000 people, 300,000 Americans protesting our deeds abroad. This goes to again kind of validate and vindicate his point in this speech when he says that none of this stuff is sustainable. And then we can move on, obviously, to the economic policy of all of these things, the over financialized American economy. We don't make anything, right? We don't, I mean, we do make things, but the things that we do make are shitty, right? Whether it's our cars, Ford, Chevy, Dodge, Chrysler, all of them are constantly rated the lowest by American watchdogs, like or American rating agencies, whether it is Kelly Blue Books or the International Institute for Highway Safety, which I think is actually a government organization, or it's the other one, JD Power, right? All of these are American institutions that rate American products, the cars, right? None of them speak favorably of American manufactured goods. None of them speak favorably of our manufacturing capacity. We look at Boeing and the type of incidences that we've had over the past year or two with Boeing, countless, right? That used to be the pride, right, of American innovation. Now it's second rate when there's only when there's only two competitors, right? So dead last, you could say. Again, that goes to speaking to the effects of actually my previous point of domestic policy of, again, not regulating like we're supposed to, not collecting taxes like we're supposed to, allowing governments, allowing corporations to influence our government as much as they'd like to, and therefore we see the results. And then there's the clear outcome of the 21st century, which is that China has overtaken the United States. What I mean by this is that one, more and more trade is being done in the yuan, as the Chinese have decided to build trade imbalances using each country's currencies, so no longer taking the United States dollar as the end all be all of the like economic trade activity, whatever. And speak of, not only are other countries, not only is China accepting other countries' currencies, but the country that is probably the most important when it comes to maintaining the United States global superpower and hegemonic status, which is Saudi Arabia, given that the sale of oil is denominated in dollars, in 2022 actually started accepting yuans for oil. So we had the petro yuan in 2022, right, which was another blow to the American economy or American status globally. We had the Belt and Road Initiative, which is very successful. They have the transition to renewable energy. They are ahead when it comes to EVs. They make cheaper EVs that are better, last longer, batteries that are faster to charge, etc., etc. A long time, not even that long ago, actually, 10 years ago, the United States was leading in creation of solar panels. Most solar panels came from the United States, and the best solar panels certainly came from the United States. That's no longer the case. In a short few years, 10 years, not only has China caught up to the United States, but China has actually exceeded and excels in making solar panels, and now is clearly outpacing the United States. And that's not just the only realm that this is happening in. And wind power, right? Power, they're also ahead in that regard. Also, I believe hydropower too, right? They're ahead there, and they're also helping other countries, again, developing nations, build their own infrastructure and build their own economies in order to hopefully become the consumers of Chinese goods, now that America is imposing crazy sanctions or planning on imposing crazy sanctions. We also look at their technology, right? We look at Huawei, right, which the United States banned Huawei products from entering the American economy under the guise of, again, national security, just like how the Patriot Act, when they were violating American citizens' rights, and constitutionally protected rights. They used the guise of national security in order to do that. They also used the guise of national security in order to prevent the American market and the American consumer to getting access to Chinese products that are clearly much better than American products. And this is not just my opinion, by the way. The manufacturers, the CEOs in America, whether it is EV manufacturers, the CEO of Ford has talked extensively about how America is far behind when it comes to EV manufacturing, which is why he's been saying, no, we need the tariffs because otherwise we can't compete. A highway EV costs between $10,000 and $20,000, and it's a really good EV. Name me an American made EV, fuck it being good, but any American EV that is between that price range. It doesn't exist. It doesn't make any sense. We also look at they released their sixth gen fighter jets. The United States does not have a sixth gen fighter jet. In fact, its fifth gen fighter jet currently has a mission readiness score of 48%, and one of them is it the fourth or fifth one? I'm not sure, but a fourth or fifth one of our fifth gen fighter jet, the one that we are constantly talking about, which is the F-35, went down. That's again between 80 and $100 million a piece. Went down. Pilot was thankfully able to eject. But this is our however many failure, like recorded failures of our fifth gen fighters. While I haven't seen one of the Chinese government, right? And they're on their sixth generation of fighter jets. We're on our fifth, and our fifth scoring 48%, falling out of the sky. Anyways, I digress. Then there's the BRICS agreement, the BRICS partnership, which is an economic partnership between China and developing nations, or actually some of them are not even developing nations, nations that are outside of the West, right? So BRICS has, it's Russia, what's the I for? Is it Indonesia? No, Indonesia just got, India, yeah. Indonesia just got added, which was a huge deal, by the way, because in terms of growing populations and where the economy in Southeast Asia is headed, Indonesia is a massive player, so that's a big dub for the Chinese and for BRICS in general. But yeah, so BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, obviously, South Africa. So those were the 5 countries that were the primary, whatever, the first countries form the BRICS alliance. But now they have added all of these other countries, and they have these observer states that are also have been invited and are going to be observing for the first year, and then I believe later on deciding whether they actually want to be a part of the BRICS partnership agreement or not. But after all of those countries, there's been the addition of, Nigeria. There's been Saudi Arabia, I believe, is an observer. So whether it's Gaza or Ukraine, that has been extremely difficult. It has been discouraging, to say the least, whether it's been the outcome of the lawsuits by South Africa. South Africa that is still honestly helping Israel a little bit, supplying them with coal, I believe, for their electricity. I'm not 100% sure if that's still going on, but it seems as though even though South Africa was paying a whole lot of lip service, and you know what, I'm not even, okay, I'm going to give the devil his credit or his due and say, things are complicated. It's not going to be easy for anybody to disentangle themselves from the Israelis, but at the same time, it does go to show you limited power that our current economic or political way of doing things allows for anybody to disengage or find alternatives to the current plunder, pillaging, and absolute oppression of the world's poor. One of these reckonings, and one of these examples of how the kids turned out all right or turned out fine, is seen in the alliance of the Sahel states, right? So this is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. These West African countries that were previously colonized by the French have been under neo-colonial rule ever since they got their independence from France, and they are we're seeing them becoming governed by younger and younger people. I believe in Senegal, it's also a very young president who just took power. And what these young leaders are doing now is they're not bowing down to Western pressure, they're not bowing down to American influence. Instead, they are taking back what's rightfully theirs, their country, right? Their land. They are expelling French troops from their countries. They are shutting down US military drone bases. They are revoking America's access to their bases, etc., etc. And this is one example of how there, the reckoning that Putin's going to talk about here shortly is unavoidable, right? And then there's also the economic reckoning that's also unavoidable given the complete inefficiency and mass waste that goes on in the overly financialized economic system of the United States. DeepSeek's R1 is an example of this. They were able to develop a much better product using dated products, fewer of those dated products, despite America sanctioning China and making sure that the latest and greatest chips from NVIDIA were not received by competitors in China. They still were able to make a fantastic product that still outcompeted that of the United States. So has been enough of a teaser with regards to President Putin's speech. Let's go ahead and play that right now. Mm, mm, right. So It's a word and a half, isn't it? Yeah. So with that said, I'll go ahead and wrap up for now. I'll go ahead and wrap up there for now. I think that was a great closing remark by Putin over there. I don't think he's this crazy person who doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not going to say that everything that he has done and that, he's beyond reproach and that I'm not going to argue, for example, the Buch. Actually, no, I might actually debate the Bucha massacre because I've seen conflicting evidence as to the numbers of killed, who did what, whatever. But again, I'm not saying that this guy's beyond reproach by any means. No, absolutely not. But this idea that we have been sold, which is that he is this maniac who doesn't make any sense and he is looking to restore the old Russian Empire, it's just not true. When he speaks, I think he makes sense. And I think he has a valid bone to pick with the United States. If you would like to read more about this, when it comes to domestic policy, I have a paper called On Reading Blacks, or an essay on leading blacks and what cannot be unburdened. This specifically talks about the black leaders in America's role in perpetuating economic inequality. I specifically talk about the role of Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Eric Holder, the former U.S. Attorney General under Obama, and then his assistant Attorney General under Barack Obama. And I also talk about foreign policy and explain why it's actually not true that the United States is somehow just an observer who's peacefully stepping in, or not peacefully stepping in, but who's stepping in order to keep the peace and prevent the big bad bully of the United States from taking advantage of little old Ukraine. I talked about how that's not true and how the evidence does not back up that retelling of history in this piece called You're Being Lied to About Two Wars, Not One, the full story on Ukraine. If you would like to check that out, go ahead and look up the Ripple Effect on Substack and enjoy. Apart from that, I would like to close with one word of the day. Right. Okay. Apart from that, I'd like to close with our word of the day. This one's from Caitlin Johnston, who, as you guys know, I'm a big fan. She said in her piece about propaganda, which, again, you can find on Substack. Here, we're big fans of Substack. She said on her piece, in one of her pieces, she said, "The empire of lies is built upon a closed set of eyelids, and once those eyes open, the whole thing comes tumbling down." Here's to that. Here's to it tumbling down sooner rather than later. So this has been The Ripple Effect. That's it. That's all I have for you today. It's been a long one. Sorry about that, guys, but I'll see you guys next week. Thank you guys for watching. Hi, thank you so much for watching The Ripple Effect. I'm your host, Henry Twagirayezu. Just reminding you to please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Every one of those actually counts because we run a very small shop here. Please follow us on Substack as well, at Henry Twagirayezu, on X, at Henry_OT, and on TikTok, at JMattyDaddy. Thank you, and see you next time.